Welcome, all of you, at this meeting held or organized out of the Free University of Amsterdam with Professor Alexander Bird. Very nice of you for all to be present here and to tune in this afternoon. Professor Bird is the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at Cambridge, and he's a member of St. John's College, one of the most prestigious colleges in Cambridge. He works in the areas of the philosophy of science, the philosophy of medicine, and also works on the concept of mental disorders. He has written a tremendous number of really good and interesting papers, in addition to a number of books, a book about Thomas Kuhn, a book about nature's metaphysics in 2008, and either the book has just been published or it is about to be published under the title Knowing Science. And in that book, Professor Bird develops and argues for a number of claims that spoke to us, such as that the aim of science is the production of knowledge. In the area of the philosophy of science, that's by no means an uncontroversial claim. He also argues that group knowledge doesn't supervene on the mental states of individual scientists. So Professor Bird is most welcome, and we are very happy that he accepted our invitation, because here at the Free University we are running a project under the title Epistemic Progress in the University. And we also think, of course, that science is an important area in which progress is possible. This is also a topic that's being discussed in his book. Perhaps I may end, before giving the floor to Professor Bird, that in addition to being a very prolific philosopher, Professor Bird is also a composer. He has written a number of really beautiful compositions, and I listened to a number of them, and the compositions of the latest years that are on his website, they're of two instruments, and they have melodic tunes that interact in beautiful ways. And of course, I had to think, when I was listening to those beautiful compositions, about another composer with the name Bird, William Bird. So, Professor Bird, many thanks for accepting this, and we're much looking forward to your talk. I'm supposing it's about a 45 minutes, 50 minutes talk, then there'll be a short break, and thereafter there will be a Q&A from the Free University, but also from people who are attending through Zoom. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, and indeed thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you today. I should say that I've got COVID, so I hope you've all got your masks on. Not badly, but if I'm sniffling a bit or a bit croaky, then please forgive me for that. Okay, so what I shall do now is I shall share my screen, which should give us this here. Let's hope that that is all working. Good. Okay. So after that very kind introduction that mentioned a whole variety of things that I do, from music to philosophy of medicine. So today we're going to be talking about progress, epistemic progress, scientific progress, and and that will fit with the project being run at the Vrije Universiteit and at the Abraham Kuyper Center. What I'm going to be doing is presenting a paper which I try and persuade readers that my view of what scientific progress is has some advantages over the competitor views. It's really quite a lot of, it's really more a paper in history of science, or at least using bits of history of science to make my case. So I'll start with introducing what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to be talking about different approaches, more general approaches, 4 approaches to thinking about scientific progress. And then I'm going to examine 3 specific accounts that fall within 3 of those 4 approaches. I'm going to leave one aside. These are specific accounts of what scientific progress is Finner-Delsen's noetic account, Yefeng Shan's functional account, and then my epistemic account. And what I'm going to be doing is a simple argument, really, is to show that there are some episodes in the history of science, some kinds of episodes for which the 2 competitor accounts of Delsen and Shan, they can't account for these developments, which I think are clearly progressive, whereas my epistemic account can deal with them, does say correctly that they are instances of scientific progress. And there are 2 kinds, rather distinct, different kinds of development in the history of science that I think that I appeal to. Perhaps the most important is modest advances in the course of normal science. I say that these are progressive, they add to knowledge, but I don't think that they satisfy the 2 other accounts. But at the other end of things, there are some unexpected and baffling discoveries in the history of science which contribute to scientific progress, but which do not satisfy the competing account, noetic and functional accounts. Okay, so that's the broad outline of what I'm doing. So let's start off by looking at the 4 different approaches to thinking about what scientific progress might be. So until about 15 years ago, I think if you were asked, what are the views about what scientific progress are, you would say that, well, there are 2 really. One, which I subsequently dubbed the semantic approach, which by semantic I mean it focuses on truth or truth-related concepts in order to explain what scientific progress is. And indeed, the standard view was that scientific progress was a matter of increasing verisimilitude, getting closer to the truth. And that's the view that you would adopt if you were a scientific realist. Whereas if you were an anti-realist, you would go for something that I've called the functional approach, where one defines a particular function for science and says that science progresses when it achieves that function. But the kind of function isn't something like truth or knowledge. It's a function that whose achievement can be assessed typically by internal examination. Right? From the inside of science, you can see that function has been achieved. So I'm thinking here in particular of, for example, Thomas Kuhn's puzzle solving approach to scientific progress, but also Larry Loudon's problem solving approach. And that was at least acceptable to anti-realists, because what it meant to solve a problem or a puzzle, you didn't require that the solution be factive. It didn't require that it be true or even near to the truth or anything like that. More recent accounts, functional approaches or functional accounts have tended to be a little bit more realist and include factive conditions. So that's why that little box is straddling the factive and non-factive conditions. One thing I did was to introduce, or at least reintroduce into the debate the thought that we might need an account that focuses not just on truth, but on knowledge, that there need to be epistemic conditions that are met. So this is more demanding than the semantic approach. So for a while, these were the sort of three approaches that got debated, but more recently, there is what might call sort of understanding or noetic approach that thinks that scientific progress really should be understood in terms of increased understanding. Typically, that's understanding is understood, to be factive. Although there are some people who take approaches to understanding that are not. Excuse me. I very briefly mentioned understanding as a possible aim of science, but I took it just to be understanding to be a subset of knowledge, knowledge of explanatory relations. But defenders of this noetic approach, in particular Finna Delson, and others who investigate understanding in philosophy of science, or many of them, as you will certainly know, take understanding to be something other than knowledge. And so that's an interesting debate within the philosophy of science. So we've got these four general approaches, and I'm going to discuss particular versions of three of them. So I'm going to leave out the semantic approach, and I'm just going to focus on these three. Okay, excuse me. Okay. So I'm going to look at particular accounts within these three more general approach. So Finna Delson's noetic account, Yafeng Shan's functional account, and my epistemic view. And so let's just briefly look at what those three competing views say. Finna Delson says the general headline idea here is that science progresses when there is an increase in scientific understanding. And then he goes on, at least in his most recent work, to give a particular view about what scientific understanding is. And that's what follows. Scientists understand some subject matter when they grasp a sufficiently accurate and comprehensive dependency model of X. So that's dependency model is roughly is a picture of dependency relations within X, perhaps causal relations, or perhaps nomic or nomological relations, or counterfactual relations, that sort of thing. And according to Finna Delson, the understanding comes in degrees. That makes sense, and the degree is proportional to the degree of accuracy and comprehensiveness of the relevant model, dependency model. And now we'll look in a few moments at spelling that out in some particular examples. Yafeng Shan's functional view says that science progresses precisely when it proposes more or additional exemplary practices. What is an exemplary practice? It's a more useful exemplary practice. And what's it for an exemplary practice to exist and to be useful? Well, this is when a practice provides a way of defining and solving research problems that is repeatable and provides a reliable framework for solutions to looking for solutions to unsolved problems. You get more testable research problems across a wider range of fields. So that's very familiar if you know the work of Kuhn or Loudon. It's that sort of general. It's similar, very similar to their views. And so my view, well, it's nice and simple. Science progresses when there is an increase in scientific knowledge. Although I do have a rider that I think also you can regard science as progressing in instances when we don't actually end up with increased knowledge, but we do things that directly promote the production of scientific knowledge. But those cases are actually fairly rare, that they don't do that without also generating knowledge. Okay, so those are the three competing views I'm being looking at. So I'm leaving out any semantic stuff at the moment, but we're happy to talk about it in the Q&A if you would like. So here are the three competing views. So what my argument is going to be is that it's true that most scientific developments exemplify all three of these. So it's, most of science is very difficult to pull these apart. So for example, Lavoisier's chemical revolution shows all three of these. Clearly, we gain more knowledge. We know about which the elements are. We know that for the first time that water is a compound of two elements, and lots of knowledge like that. There is an increase in understanding, and in particular of dependency relations. We know that water depends in a certain way on these two other elements, which we subsequently call hydrogen, and we get to call hydrogen and oxygen. So there's a dependency relationship there, and in general, we know how compounds depend on elements, and many more other dependency relations we acquire. Lavoisier certainly gave us greater understanding, and there is definitely an increase in useful exemplary practices. So there's a lot of new ways of doing science, and practices were introduced by Lavoisier, in particular various quantitative techniques in chemistry, as well as the, for much of the early 19th century, here's an exemplary practice, discovering which the elements are. Now, with Lavoisier, we see that there are lots of elements, and it's important to know which substances are elements and which are compounds, and how the compounds are constructed out of the elements. So nice. In that case, we see that it's clearly scientific progress, and all the accounts say that there's scientific progress. So there's nothing to choose between them. I could have made similar remarks about the discovery of the structure of DNA. We now know what that structure is. It gave us greater understanding, for instance, of the mechanisms of heredity, and it led to new exemplary practices, which have led up to things like the whole science of genomics. Okay, so most science does all three at the same time, but I argue that some scientific developments demonstrate only the accumulation of knowledge and not the other two things, and not understanding or dependency relationship models, nor new exemplary practices. So if that's correct, these developments, if they're progressive, you will support my view, but not the other two views. And as I've already advertised, there are going to be two kinds of case: modest advances during normal science, and then also unexpected and baffling discoveries. So I'm going to argue that all these cases I'm going to be talking about are ones where we see an accumulation of knowledge, and that they are additions to or contributions to scientific progress, but we don't get these other, the two competing views or accounts are not satisfied. Okay, so I'll start, although I said on the end here, I talked about unexpected and baffling discoveries and modest advances in science. These are two quite different kinds of case. I'll start with the second. And here's an unexpected and baffling discovery, and that was one of the most famous episodes in the history of science, Röntgen's discovery of X-rays. So, and this occurred in 18 1995, Röntgen published a small handful of papers on this subject. Other people were absolutely fascinated by these X-rays, and in 1901, just on 6 years later, Röntgen was awarded the first Nobel Prize in physics for his discovery. So, as you all know, these X-rays are produced in a cathode Crookes cathode ray tube, and under certain conditions. The point I want to make is that it is really simple. It's quite simple that Röntgen's discovery was an addition of knowledge. We now know that these rays exist, and we know some things about what they can do. For instance, that is that famous X-ray photograph of his wife's hand and her wedding ring. But at the time when Röntgen was given the Nobel Prize in 1901, there was very little understanding of X-rays, and no new exemplary practices had been developed that, well, at least some had been, but they weren't, that wasn't what the contribution to scientific progress that this discovery contributed. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a sort of flavor of the disagreements, so there were diverse theories that many of which couldn't be right because they were based on the false theory of there being an electromagnetic ether. I mean, to begin with, scientists couldn't agree even that these things were electromagnetic in nature. Edison thought that they were like acoustical waves, and Oliver Lodge thought they had something to do with gravity. But eventually, the opinion did settle on the idea that X-rays were electromagnetic in nature. But because everybody, or most people, who were accepting of the ether theory, there was still lots of room for people to have quite false theories of what X-rays were. So some British scientists, including George Stokes and J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron, took X-rays to be impulses in the ether and not continuous waves. Why is that? Well, this is a very important reason, because X-rays seemed to be able to concentrate energy in a very specific way, in a way that couldn't be explained by waves. And this was demonstrated by the ability of X-rays to excite electrons. For that reason, William Henry Bragg held X-rays to be particles, because that was, they were concentrated rather than waves. Röntgen's own view was that X-rays were waves, but were longitudinal waves, not transverse waves. So they were like sound waves, not like ordinary light waves. This was the state of what people were thinking about X-rays in 1901 when Röntgen received his Nobel Prize. Now, the important thing about that date is it preceded the time at which people began to get the first correct views of what X-rays were, and that really needed to wait for the development of the quantum theory, and in particular Einstein's work on the photoelectric effect, linking light to the quantum theory, which allowed an understanding of how it was that light could, or an electromagnetic radiation could excite electrons. So I think, so it seems to be clear to me that there is this important discovery that's a contribution to scientific progress. There is important addition of knowledge, but there's very little by way of understanding or or accurate knowledge or accurate grasp of a dependency model. That was to come later. How about useful exemplary practices? Well, as the photograph shows, that it was pretty quickly realized that X-rays could be used for medical purposes. And so that was an exemplary practice that developed quite quickly. But it wasn't for this reason that Röntgen was awarded the Nobel Prize. And I don't think that's what the progress of science that his discovery represented consisted in. It would still have been progressive even if nobody had ever developed medical X-rays. Within science, X-rays were used for the exemplary practice of X-ray crystallography. But again, that didn't really develop until a few years later, and that merited its own distinct Nobel Prize to the Braggs in 1915. So I think that neither of the other two theories about what scientific progress is able to account for the discovery of X-rays being a moment of important progress in science, whereas the epistemic, my epistemic view can. Okay, so that's my first science case. Now I'm going to look at two other areas of the history of science, which I think also make the case for me, but they're rather different. But both of them have this in common, that they're less exciting than Röntgen's discovery. In fact, the point about them is really that they are rather boring, because they concern the acquisition of piecemeal bits of knowledge, but in ways that don't add greatly to understanding or to exemplary practices. So the history of astronomy, I think, illustrates this quite well. What I'm going to concentrate on actually is the history of star catalogues. So this bit of Raphael's painting, The School of Athens, is supposed to show on the left and right Hipparchus and Ptolemy, allegedly. Hipparchus, possibly the greatest astronomer of the ancient world, developed the first star catalogue. So he just recorded stars, and he followed what he'd invented. So it was definitely this exemplary practice. He invented the way of classifying them according to their brightness. Then Ptolemy adopted, possibly slightly fraudulently, Hipparchus's discoveries and produced his own star catalogue. So what a star catalogue really has the basic elements of listing the stars that have been observed, with their brightness and the positions in the sky. A star catalogue might include the naming system, this work was highly influential. So the next great star catalogue to be developed incorporated their work, and that was the work, and it's the Book of Fixed Stars by the Persian astronomer Abdallah Rahman al-Sufi. But it was also built on by this guy, Johann Bayer, in the 16th century, who added another 1,000, large number of stars. And then we've got also it's the other way around. We've got Tycho Brahe, we're obviously working, be assisted by Johannes Kepler. We've got produced the next great star catalogues, but all of these were star catalogues you produced with the the naked eye. The next really important development was using this telescope to give us many more stars, including, of course, those that could not be seen with the naked eye. So this was the great work by John Flamsteed, and both he and Bayer introduced naming systems that are still in use today. Bayer's system was one that involved Greek letters and their constellations. So that's how we get names, things like Alpha Centauri and the like, and Gamma Cephei. That all comes from Bayer's naming system. But Flamsteed's naming system is also in use today. And Flamsteed's work was then picked up by Caroline and William Herschel, and so it goes on. In their case, what they really wanted to do was have a really good catalogue of the fixed stars, so that they could determine whether they were something they're observing was a star or a comet. So Caroline Herschel was really into discovering new comets, and indeed one of these discoveries led to basically her brother's discovering the planet Uranus. Okay, so why I'm telling you all this? Look, what we have here certainly are some new exemplary practices introduced on a few occasions, but most of the time what these characters are doing is in some ways rather boring. It's you're spending all night very carefully recording the positions of stars and their brightness, and checking other people's work of the same sort, and producing these amazing and important, valuable catalogues of the stars and their brightnesses and their positions. It's now, I think it's difficult to deny that this constitutes a long history of the progress of astronomy. Not all of these things are hugely exciting. Discovery of Uranus, yes, but the addition of a dozen stars here, a new nebula there, and the rest of it, not hugely exciting, but progress nonetheless. Not all progress is great leaps and bounds. Some progress is marginal progress or slow progress, but progress it is nonetheless, and that's because we know more about which stars they are and where they are, how bright they are, and so forth. And I don't think that this progress can be accounted simply by the relatively small number of advances in exemplary practice. I mean, there were like the introduction of the telescope by Flamsteed, or Bayer's cataloging system, or Caroline Herschel's introducing a new system of cataloging them using their polar distance rather than the constellation and so forth. But those were not the only instances of progress. And there's very little by way in increase in terms of knowledge of dependency relations or dependency models. This is just a list of facts, really. So I don't think there's any all these additions of new stars in these catalogues constitutes any great addition to understanding. Okay, so sort of boring, but most of normal science is boring, and I think it's misleading if we focus our notion of what scientific progress constitutes on the exciting and flashy instances, developments of science. Those are the ones we like to talk about, but a lot of science just isn't like that. And I'm going to briefly talk about another sort of set of episodes of the same sort, but a rather different area of science, and that's the field that once upon a time was called natural history. Okay, so again, it's somewhat similar to what I was saying about these star catalogues. Really, what we'll see is that there is a lot of addition of little piecemeal bits of knowledge. So natural history is built upon three basic practices: the careful observation of flora and fauna in their habitats, the collection and preservation of samples, and the naming and classification of species. And these three practices reinforced one another. The ancient author Dioscorides you listed and described a large number of plants, and in this work here, the professor of medicine at Tübingen, Leonhard Fuchs, in his day Historia Plantarum, he compared descriptions given by Dioscorides to plants that he knew, and said, well, what Dioscorides is talking about this one because it satisfies the description. And he added, and this is the important thing about printing, he was able to add these pictures. This is so other naturalists could know that they were all talking about the same things. And that's certainly an important element in enabling scientific progress. Now, of course, I think it's fair to say that this is a set of exemplary practices developed by the likes of Fuchs. But what it enabled people to do is really to do the same as what Aristotle and Theophrastus were doing on the island of Lesbos, which is, as I say, just to observe animals and plants in their habitat and to record those observations and to classify the species in question. So if you look at Aristotle's De Historia Animalium, I mean, it's full of amazing details and advances in our knowledge. Some stuff was badly wrong, but some things are impressive additions to knowledge. So, for example, he was the first to observe that dolphins give birth to live young, and so should be classified with the quadrupedal mammals. Now, it's true that Aristotle was looking for causal relations amongst things, and in some senses, working out the relationship, seeing how dolphins give birth to live young is to spot a causal relationship, a dependency relationship. But actually, his knowledge of causation in zoology was actually rather limited because, thanks to his theory, his more general theories, he didn't engage in very much experimental biology. He just observed. He did, and it's very difficult to establish causal relations by mere observation in zoology or indeed in botany. So most of his book is just descriptive of novel facts, and is rather less successful when it comes to trying to establish causal or other dependency relations. So Aristotle adds something to our understanding, but a whole lot more to our knowledge. And what I'm suggesting is that it's both of these add to progress, but as it were, we should think of Aristotle's work and indeed Theophrastus's as being a great contribution to scientific progress, because they just discovered a whole lot of new facts, stuff that we just didn't know before. So botany and zoology didn't, with the exception of stuff that's related to medicine, didn't really make many advances until the early modern era. But things really took off in the 18th century, when natural history became something of a highly popular science, carried out not only by sort of full-on paid-up scientists, by lots of other people as well. I mean, the distinction between scientists and non-scientists wasn't really a thing then. So let's think about this character here, Edward Jenner, famous for vaccination, but he was made a Fellow of the Royal Society, a great honour, but not for vaccination, but for something else completely different. Aristotle had observed that the cuckoos lay their eggs in the nests of smaller birds, people were aware that the eggs of the host bird were pushed out of the nest, and in effect the parent bird was forced to raise the cuckoo's egg, but it was generally thought that it was the adult cuckoo who would push out the eggs when laying her own in the host nest. But Jenner was the first to observe that, in fact, it is the young cuckoo that pushes out the competing eggs, and the young cuckoo has a sort of depression in its back between its wings that allows it to do that very effectively. So that was his discovery that gave him the Fellowship of the Royal Society. That's just to give a little example of the sort of thing that 18th and early 19th century naturalists were engaged in. Very much the same sort of thing that Theophrastus and Aristotle were engaged in a couple of thousand years before, just recording lots of interesting facts. One of the best known naturalists of that era is this chap here, Gilbert White, whose very famous set of letters, The Natural History of Selborne. It recorded vast numbers of facts about flora and fauna in his part of the world, things that helped do things like establish the fact of bird migration by carrying out the first bird census. And there were a lot of, I think what's important about these episodes is that there are instances of understanding causal and other dependency relations, and there are novel useful exemplary practices, such as the bird census and having pre-printed forms for carrying it out. But on the whole, these advances in understanding and indeed exemplary practice are relatively small compared to the vast growth of our knowledge that these observers provided. And I think that those lots of individual facts that don't add up to yet a huge amount of understanding are nonetheless instances of scientific progress. Not the greatest instances, far from it, but nonetheless instances very well. And the main reason that they don't add up to a great deal of understanding against the Delson's noetic view is that there was no satisfactory true grand theory within which to lodge these facts. That, of course, had to wait until Charles Darwin. and later Mendel. But of course, for this purpose, Darwin is the important character. Darwin himself was hugely influenced by the work of the likes of Gilbert White. He mentions that very specifically in his autobiography. Until Darwin, there wasn't much in the way of great additions to understanding. I mean, I think a good example here really is Alexander von Humboldt, who voluminous writings. He made important methodological advances. He did bring some increase in understanding of dependency relations, some increases in understanding. But these really make up only a small fraction of his work. Pre-Darwin, it didn't really, the contribution to understanding in any significant way was necessarily going to be limited. But nonetheless, he made an enormous contribution to the advancements of science because he discovered a whole load of new, interesting and important facts in his biogeography of Latin America in particular. Okay, so I think I'll come to the end and then see what crops up in our discussion. But the thing I would like to remind you what I've been trying to do, I mean, it's a fairly simple argument, really, is that these instances in the history of science are ones that can be accounted for by my epistemic account because they all show additions to knowledge, but they don't show much in the way either of increases in understanding, and in particular of grasp of these dependency models, nor do they always show the introduction of new useful methodologies or exemplary practices. And I focused on two other extreme kinds of case. The most boring and the most exciting. Modest advances in the course of normal science, star catalogues and the recording of natural history on the one hand, and the unexpected and baffling discoveries such as X-rays. So why are these two extremes the ones that suit my account? Why? Well, I think it's because on the one hand, the modest advances, they add to knowledge, but they're so modest that the interesting advances in understanding and the exemplary practices, the methodological advances, these have already happened. Those have been put in place, and now what we're doing is the normal science of using that understanding, using those exemplary practice to generate new knowledge. But that is progress. The generation of new knowledge against the background of well-established understanding and methodology is still progress nonetheless. So they're so modest that they advance knowledge, but not these other things. At the other extreme, things like X-rays are good for me because they clearly involve new knowledge, the existence of these new rays and some of their properties. But they're so unexpected and so baffling that they don't add anything to understanding, nor are they, and for that very reason, aren't well suited to giving us novel and useful exemplary practices. That will have to wait, further down the road before those can come. So that's my case for why the best account of what scientific progress is this epistemic one, the addition of new pieces of scientific knowledge. Okay, that's me done. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Professor Bird.